At the beginning of December, this happened.
NYPD is responding to reports of a man with a firearm outside the United Nations headquarters on the east side.
And you could chalk it up to another crazy person having a bad day in the Big Apple, but a few details caught my attention. The man only ever pointed the shotgun at himself, there was only one round in the weapon, and he calmly negotiated with the NYPD for around 3 hours, eventually surrendering to them peacefully once they met his single demand, which was that they hand over the stack of documents he brought with him, the ones you see here, to the United Nations for review. Now, holding a gun to your head outside the UN, pretty insane, but at the same time it seems like it was all part of his plan, one that he appears to have successfully executed, so how crazy could he be? And, more importantly, what is in those frigging files? What was with possible death and certain imprisonment? Are we talking about Epstein here? Aliens? What? But weeks later, there's still precious little information to be had, and predictably, the news cycle has gone on without filling in many of the blanks. They did, however, give me his name and hometown, and after one simple Google search, I found the name of his wife. After much internal debate, I decided to reach out to her for any insights or details, and to my surprise, after all, here I am, a stranger barging into her life at a terrible moment, she replied. Oh, and apparently, I am the only person to have reached out to her to try and figure out what happened and why. What is going on with the news these days, guys? Anyway, what you're about to see is the result of our chats via Messenger and email, and I think it goes a long way to answering most of the questions I had. Straight off the bat, yes, William Joseph Joe Tingler is a troubled man. And this traces back to when he was accidentally poisoned in 2007. At this point, Joe Tingler was a 30-year veteran air traffic controller working at Jacksonville Airport. The roof of the control tower and radar room were being renovated, and isocyanates, a chemical compound found in things like foams, sealants, and glue, leaked into Tingler's work area. His complaints and those of his colleagues about the weird smell fell on deaf ears for over a week and were dismissed. It seems like they were told to, tough it out. Then many of them, Tingler included, started becoming severely ill with asthma, rashes, and other flu-like symptoms. But it also only happened when they came to work. For a while, this was chalked up to malingering. Eventually, and I'm talking like 10 days later, the FAA acknowledged that something was wrong and took corrective action. An independent report into the incident, released over a decade later, would place the blame on the FAA. Now, although Tingler and his colleagues were vindicated and they received a diagnosis and treatment, the damage had already been done. At any moment, they might suffer a severe asthma attack if exposed to even small quantities of isocyanates. All of this was very disturbing to Tingler, who took pride and still takes pride in his physical fitness, and he also felt betrayed by superiors and the system they oversaw. As a result, soon after the poisoning, he suffered what sounds like a nervous breakdown and was forced to retire from the career he loved, one his wife says he would have done for free. In the years that followed, despite still finding moments of joy with family, he became more introverted, obsessive, and prone to bouts of depression and anxiety. So now you're probably thinking that the files are about his poisoning. Well, you're wrong. In fact, the files detail what Tingler believes are human rights violations being perpetrated by the British government on the remote island of St. Helena. Now, stick with me, we're going down a rabbit hole here. In case you've never heard of the place, St. Helena is in the middle of the South Atlantic. It is a British territory with a British governor, but also has its own independent government, courts, and bureaucracy. Formerly a stop for trade and passenger ships, the island is one of the most isolated in the world. So isolated, in fact, that it was famously chosen as the place where Napoleon was banished after Waterloo. A new, controversial airport has only slightly improved this situation. The island is currently home to under 5,000 people. Roughly half of these so-called saints can trace their heritage to slaves brought to the island during the colonial era. And this colonial legacy still shapes the community today. There is a tension of varying degrees of intensity, depending on who you ask, between the locals, who often live in poverty, and the expatriates, mostly from the UK, who are paid better and seem to have outsized influence on the island. So, if you knew nothing about the island, now you have a little bit more information. Tingler, on the other hand, has traveled there many times over several decades and is intimately acquainted with the politics, people, and history of St. Helena. And this is all thanks to his wife. She is from St. Helena, and her parents, now in their 80s, still live there. His actions outside the UN trace their origin back to 2017, when his father-in-law's eye surgery was botched in St. Helena's General Hospital. Because of the size of the population and their isolation, think of it as a small town in the middle of nowhere, specialist care is not readily available. So sometimes specialists with their teams and equipment are imported, and several surgeries are arranged to happen around the same time. In his father-in-law's case, there was some confusion and the wrong lens was implanted into his eye. Instead of evacuating him to Cape Town for specialist care, something done by the island in medical emergencies, the hospital directorate and then governor of the island allegedly instructed the doctor, the one who had just botched the original surgery, to perform a second corrective surgery. Doctors who later reviewed the case say that this procedure was the wrong course of action and caused more harm than good. Outraged, Tingler's wife and in-laws filed complaints which were, according to a pending court case, ignored by the island's government, and their later appeals to the British government for an independent investigation also fell on deaf ears. With no acknowledgement of wrongdoing or an apology, the family filed a suit against the hospital and the island's government in St. Helena's internal court system. Unable to find an attorney on the island willing to assist them, the family had to do the legal work themselves, and Tingler, from the USA, began helping out with the case, and it quickly became his obsession. Now, Tingler's wife tells me that she believes that had her father been an expat instead of a saint, he would have been evacuated sooner and likely would have received care that would have restored his eyesight. And she sees her father's case as part of a pattern of behavior by the island's government and Great Britain that is reminiscent of the racism and classism of the colonial era. But for Mr. Tingler, it isn't reminiscent of the era, it is simply a continuation of it. In his writing, in his mind, he has directly linked this case to the Atlantic slave trade, and in particular a burial ground dating from the 1840s, discovered on the island in 2012. I still don't know enough about the island to comment on the extent of Mr. Tingler's delusion, but I will say that from the facts I've been able to corroborate, it seems like he took the least charitable or positive interpretation in each case, and in linking them together so directly, it made them all the worse. So it seems that over the years, the case slowly morphed from a medical malpractice suit into his quixotic quest to save the saints. Through his father-in-law's case, Mr. Tingler was exposed to 4 years of legal wrangling that, from what I've been told, would have frustrated even hardened veteran attorneys. As the case morphed and he took on a larger role, the stress mounted and began to negatively impact on his already fragile mental health. In September 2021, to counter this, he was placed on new antidepressants, but according to his wife, instead of helping him, they left him more withdrawn and anxious than ever before. And then in October 2021, the St. Helena Supreme Court dismissed the family's most recent legal action. According to Tingler's wife, this dismissal precludes the possibility of a fair trial when the case is finally heard in April 2022. Seeing his in-laws' deep disappointment at the court's decision via Skype, and probably taking it very personally because he is so personally involved in the case, it all finally seems to have been too much for Mr. Tingler's damaged psyche to bear. Decades ago, long before his poisoning, Tingler had taken a dramatic, heroic action, risking his own life to save the lives of a pilot and co-pilot of a downed chopper by fearlessly taking command of a rescue boat and braving the reef and waves that had thwarted the previous rescue attempts of the professional crew. And in 2000, he risked his career to become a whistleblower, reporting to the federal government safety issues and near misses that were happening at Daytona Beach International Airport, as well as the lack of corrective action being taken by management there. I mention these because it seems that in December 2021, this impulse to do something decisive, even at extreme personal risk, again took hold. But this time it was happening within the framework of a warped mental state and, for lack of a better word, delusion that he had constructed for himself. I can imagine that with the legal action dismissed, he felt the only hope of receiving justice for his father-in-law and, of course, liberating the islanders, was to appeal directly to the United Nations to intervene where the British government had not. But how can an ordinary person get their attention? Well, you've been watching how. Now, it's not immediately clear when he decided on this course of action, but a few days after spending Thanksgiving with his family, here he is with his children and grandchildren, and giving no warning of what he had planned, he gathered up all the documents he could find that he felt proved his case, grabbed his shotgun, and took that 2-day drive from Florida to the United Nations headquarters in New York. Now, I haven't reviewed every document, but I think we can agree probably not the right course of action, particularly as the UN looked at the documents and had no idea what to do with them. And I think most of us would all be fine with calling this some kind of madness. But that being said, if you've come to believe that an entire community, one that includes your elderly mother-in-law and father-in-law, were being terribly abused and the government was complicit or at best incompetent, you'd be crazy not to take some kind of meaningful action, right? I want to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Tingler's wife for sharing as much as she did with me. I can't imagine how difficult it must be for her and her family, and of course, Mr. Tingler. He is, as of recording this, being held in Bellevue for psychiatric evaluation. Bellevue's in New York, and they expect that he'll be released to his family's care before New Year's, with a hearing set for early next year. The major charges, basically that he was a terrorist, appear to have been dropped. I'm assuming that this hearing will not lead to a criminal trial, and he will be placed into the care of professionals who will oversee his treatment. But whatever happens, it seems like he and his family have a difficult road ahead, but I hope that he will get the help he needs. Finally, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and share it. And yeah, I hope you have an awesome 2022. Goodbye, guys.